Okay, so let me explain penalties. The main idea with penalties is that the the idea of course, is that it's going to get called, right? You raise the penalty values because there's a hope that they're going to get called. The reality of how these games are designed is that they're not called. Some of them are called, some of them aren't. Now, how it affects gameplay is it's based on when the animation or how the animation displays and appears, triggers, however which way you want to put it. When those animations get triggered, it's now based on what is the percentage or the chance of that penalty value or that penalty itself being called by the referee. And that's really all it comes down to. So basically, the mindset of a player is, can I get away with it, right? And at what level can I get away with it at? So holding, for example, really tight window at holding. If you go at 50, you're still good. This won't be called as much. 55, called a little bit more. 60, 65, 70, all those higher ones, they get called. So how would that affect gameplay? Well, if we go into the mindset of, can I get caught holding, right? At a lower value, because that penalty won't be called, then the animation will trigger more often, right? Because that animation triggers more often, that means a hold is, being somebody's getting away with holding longer, which can affect the pass game, of course, right? Holding blocks longer, run game, holding blocks longer, right? So that's how, just in the nutshell, of how penalties will work. Now they get a little more complicated as you go through them, because some of them also affect mentality. I use offside as something a lot more this year than I have in the past, and I always knew what it did, but I never actually truly used it because it was, I had other values that I could control with it, like pass coverage and gameplay sliders. But from a focus on penalty sliders, offside is a really interesting one because it keeps your coverage really tight. Because let's think about again the mentality of a player. If they have offside, thinking, okay, I cannot be on the other line, on the other side of the line of scrimmage, right? Now, if that value is lower, right, that means that they're going to try to get to that point quicker, right? Because they're trying to get away with it, right? So they're trying to get there faster and faster, right? So that's why you see that swarm of players, of linebackers, especially this year, just swarming to the ball carrier as quickly as possible, and in droves too, and just, pretty much running the same way. Now, when we have that higher, they spread out, right? Because they don't want to get caught, right? Multiple players don't want to get caught being caught offside. So naturally, they're going to spread out and, be good boys and not get caught. Now, the other side of that, from a coverage perspective, it's the same idea. It's a more of a mentality thing. How can I stay underneath the route of the receiver, right? Without actually making contact with them. But I'm still going to be on their side. So if the line of scrimmage is behind them, right, that's the side that I'm going to be covering them on, and going from there. So that's why they're a lot tighter, just naturally, because there's a friction there that's going on where, the cornerback is trying to stay near the where the receiver was just at, but not to the point that they're guessing the route, and showing like they're mirroring or anything like that. So that's how offside works, with the sense of pass coverage and the sense of just covering the ball carrier, or kind of tracking down the ball carrier. Next value is false start. Honestly, I know this value, from an animation point. Let's think about how false start happens, right? The lineman jumps up right away. They get ready to move, and I think this value could be lower, and it could help with some of that. But I've tested it, and I don't really see that much of an impact from it. But it does trigger an animation, but not at the consistency or the effectiveness that I think that I'd like it to use. In the past, that's what we've used to kind of raise them up, because we want, not only do we want the penalty to be called, but we'd also want that animation to trigger a little bit sooner. So basically, the lineman jumping up and preparing to block. But it's not as effective this year, so I haven't used it as much. And kind of what I mentioned about offensive holding. Again, the idea of getting away with it or not getting away with it, right? So offensive holding is one of the strongest cases for penalty sliders affecting gameplay because it does affect how long a block is held, and then what happens. It can be further down the field. It can happen at the first level, the second level, etc. But it also can affect of course the penalty being called, right? So that's a big one as well. I'm always a big advocator of having higher offensive holding, for the sake of just having a penalties called, right? And a lot of people don't like penalties being called for offensive holding, which, once you hit in that 55, 60, I'd say 60 to 70 for college football, um, it's not a bad setup to have a higher penalty. The problem is what will happen though, and especially in college football, if it's too high, again, the mentality of not wanting to get caught, right? So what happens? They don't hold their block as long. They release. That can result in what's called insta shed, where the defensive lineman just sheds them away, and boom, they're right on the ball carrier. And with the fact that college football needs so much help, with the run game, and just holding blocks longer, it's natural to think that, okay, we've got to go offensive holding. We've got to lower the value. And that's what I have, in particular for my All American set, and for my Heisman set. I just have it at 50. So it's kind of a give and take. You don't want you want some support, right? And you want enough support where the offensive lineman can hold their block long enough to where the running back can at least get some decent yardage, especially the computer this year. So that's why that value is where it's at. And in general, if you want more penalties, raise holding, but you're gonna have to balance some things out. This year, college football is a bit of a mess because of what we have to do for not just the penalties, but also for especially for the gameplay sliders as well. So face mask is a really interesting one, because there's been in the past where you could just bump face mask and it would get called, and then you'd also see the animation trigger, right? So the animation trigger is, of course, just the player just tackling and usually wrapping around and grabbing the face mask. And the thought would be that they'd want to get away with it more often, right? They want to get away with it more often. So, of course, super low value to get more wrap-up type of tackles. But at a certain point in time, with college football in particular, and Madden seemed to follow suit, is that there's a threshold in which the animation won't trigger anymore, and it's if you go too high, because of course they don't want to get caught, so the animation won't trigger as much, and because in this year, I think there's an issue there where because the value is that if it's at a high level, the animation doesn't trigger as much, and because the penalty value or the penalty itself doesn't get called, so it's a little frustrating because we used to use face mask as a way, to create that effect, to create that wrap effect, and now it doesn't happen as often, and so that's what we get instead. Is we now have to kind of play around with, where that threshold is. Like if we go to 5, for example, what happens then? Are they always going to get away with it, or are they always going to go for a harder tackle instead? And kind of a little segue into that is I believe face mask is what controls the severity of the tackles, but more so for college football in particular, I feel like it also controls what part of the body, the tackles go into. So if we think about face mask, where does it start? It starts, exactly where, towards the head, right? Because that's where the face mask is. So as we go lower in the value, we go towards, we go for the neck, we go for the chest, we go for the waist, and so forth. And so the mentality that I had here in particular, is one where if we go under 50, okay, we're now going, we're going a little bit below the head. We're also going below the shoulders, and so that's why there's more waist type of tackles. And that's kind of what's more realistic, I feel like, based on the tackling value that I have, which is at a lower value in the 40s. So again, it's all relative to the sliders you use, but relative to that, I do see better tackling and they go from the waist down, and this also reduces some of those effects of broken tackles as well. because broken tackles, you're not what I saw before when we had it at a really low value. Um, they would try to get away with too much, and then they'd try to go too high, and so again, this is one of the weirder values that I've found this year, especially in college football. Legal block in the back. This is the big one. This is kind of what has changed the game for me. And so, what I will say about illegal block in the back is that we started this value fairly high because there was a finding that from a guy on Operation Sports named Flex. Flex on them is their full alias. But found out that it allowed a pocket to be formed around the QB. And the way I determined, for my testing to support what he's talking about was because I've gone the other way now, is because it sets up the pocket because there's not as much clipping. There's not as much pushing in the back as it sounds, right? The offensive lineman isn't getting away with things where they can hit defensive tackles, defensive ends low, right? They can't block really low, get them in the legs or anything like that. What you see now with the value lower, you see different types of those kind of blocking animations. So now it's not just, straight up blocking and letting in swim moves or whatever, power moves, etc. Now you see blocks a little lower. Some of them don't look, I wouldn't say if they don't look legal. I don't think they've implemented that part of it. But some of it definitely looks a little bit more jarring. And you see a little bit more fight back from the offensive linemen. How many times now have I seen offensive linemen literally just push defensive tackles on their butts? And not in like the pancake kind of animation where they're holding it and then they just eventually fall down. No, they're really hitting them. And then I see guys hitting them low and different animations there. And so what that automatically does is, what's happened for the perspective, right, or the perception, is that makes the QB kind of want to be a little bit more aware of what's directly in front of him, right? So you'll notice if you've played recently with the slider set, you've noticed the quarterback be a lot more evasive, right? Be a lot basically be a lot more smarter with their decision making. Quicker, if anything, not always smarter, but because they don't have as much time in their perception, because their offensive lineman is fully committed to whatever blocking mechanic they've done, and instead of having a patient kind of pocket forming around them where they have a little bit more time, right? And they have just they can then make those accurate decisions, or they can just go for the deep ball constantly. And they don't throw into coverage as much or into contested catching positions, for the receivers. So that's been the balance of block in the back. And essentially you could get decent play out of 50, but I went lower here because it not only helps the quarterback's perception, but it also helps the running back in seeing different holes that could appear. Not saying it helps their pathfinding, not saying outside zone is fixed or anything like that. No, it's more so that it's just like there are now some more lanes because of the additional blocking mechanics that appear. Now you see different types of, you see more, you literally will see more blocks in the back, some more clipping type of calls, not called. That's the beauty of it. And that's really the next part of that. Again, it's not going to get called because it's under 50. It's a low penalty value that I'm using here. So that means you get more benefit with the quarterback's perception, the running back's perception, and then just the simple fact that there's a little bit more, those outstanding linebackers and defenders are being blocked a little bit better. Not even in just like the holding sense, but just also in the different blocking mechanics. And so that's how illegal block in the back has worked. And if you've tried the set, you should have noticed the difference, especially if you played in my earlier sets where I had the value at 80, because that pass protection looked really good, and the way the quarterback steps up is really nice. Now they still step up. They move side to side, backwards, forwards. It's a really amazing thing, and we've seen a lot less sacks as a result. And it's been a really nice adjustment, and it has really changed the game for a while. And I really give a lot of credit to Flex on them from Operation Sports for making the suggestion to even work on illegal block in the back. And then and it's been a really good change, and I would highly recommend um, m- managing that value to what works for your slider set. For me, I recommend it lower the way it is for both Madden and college football. So this next value is roughing the passer. Roughing the passers is a really strong. Um, it's a strong penalty value. It's the same idea of getting caught versus not getting caught. But the thing is with roughing the passer, it's like you can't go if you go above 50. It's such a sensitive slider that it will instantly get called majority of the time. I mean, you know, in the idea of roughing the passer, of course, is let's think about the player, right? We're going to get away with hitting the quarterback or not hitting the quarterback, right? After they've thrown the ball. If you go too high in this, or if you even go to like 55, you'll start seeing the players simply just tapping the running back, tapping the quarterback in any sort of fashion, and it seems to get called. So in the sense of how we use it for gameplay, relative to the penalties affecting gameplay, I use it as a means for aggression, because let's think about if we put that under 50, now it's not going to get called as much. So what happens? Now we get pressure. Now we get really high amounts of pressure into the quarterback, into them dropping back into the ball carrier. So now your pursuit angles, right? Those are really aggressive. That's why you can see some issues with some pursuit angles if you go too low on this value, because now they're just be way too aggressive. And of course, it's always relative to your speed parity and maybe some of your other gameplay slider values. But in the bare sense of roughing the passer, that's what I've always used it as, an aggression value for the defense. And so there's been some iterations of college football Madden where it affected their pursuit of the ball in the air. But not as much this year from what I can tell. What I've seen a lot is offside controls a lot of that as well. But offside is the premise to be in the right position to start with. That's why coverage is better in that sense. So defensive pass interference. Now, I get the premise of defensive pass interference, right? And it is a value that can get called. I don't think it matters as much if you go too high on this value. Now, how you get too low, there's some people that believe that it affects coverage. I understand the idea because we're thinking about a cause and result, right? We're thinking about like what's the result? Well, it has to be based on this, right? If it's a low value, that means they're going to be tighter in coverage. Why? Because the animation of DPI needs to show up, which is holding the receiver as the ball is thrown, running into them as the ball is thrown. That's usually reflected to speed parity in some areas there. But the way I see it, it doesn't just trigger a canned animation. It's also one that essentially prepares them to result in that animation, right? So how do you get into? They're not going to do it from 20 yards away. That animation won't pop up. So it's a proximity thing more than anything. Personally, I don't follow under more so I don't follow the effectiveness of it, right? I don't say you can put this at 5 and now coverage is going to be super duper tight. I don't think that's the way it's impacted. I think it's more so one of those where it's at the perception of the animation to pop up, like what's going to trigger the animation, because it's an actual value that gets called, right? So if we have it too low, doesn't mean the animation is just going to trigger left and right. I like to think of defensive pass interference relative to the pass defensive reaction value. I'd rather use a pass defensive reaction value on the gameplay sliders to get that kind of that reaction and that animation, and then hopefully because everything else is set in place, like what I use for offside, is now basically how it all now gets them in the right position anyways. Not using defensive pass interference as a way to control the entire coverage on the route. So I'm going to skip down for these ones because I don't really use ineligible, don't really have much opinion on that. Offensive pass interference, I started to think that maybe there's a perception that the offensive pass interference on would help the receivers with the separation of the catching and everything. But it's good where it's at. Just keep it on. Kick catch, I don't really believe that has much impact. There's definitely some guys that believe these ones have big impacts, and I've tested it, and I've also tried to work that theory out, and it's placebo more than I can see. So I stick to the basics after that. So kick catch, offensive pass, ineligible, they don't seem to affect gameplay as much. Somebody's going to come in here and probably say they do. I need animations, right? I need animations. I don't see any significant animations that change with that. Running into the kicker, same thing, right? Roughing the kicker, same thing, right? I'll be honest, I was under, because I was trying to fix the outside zone so much in college football that I was like, I was telling Mr. Hurricane, Kane, I was like, hey, man, look, we could put roughing the kicker, we turn it off. What happens when they're roughing the kicker? They're going around and they're taking out the kicker from the side. That's just like outside zone. Maybe if we turn it off now, now that'll be the perception that the offensive lineman will block him, and then now we'll get that outside zone perfectly. So let's just turn it off. And I said, why not, right? I said, let's do it. I'm going to do it. I said, I'm going to put it up on the set, and I did, and it didn't work. It was a placebo. It just okay. Like, moving on. Intentional grounding. This is the only, this one, I would say this one and maybe illegal contact, maybe. Illegal contact is something I probably used in the past to try to get an animation to appear while at the line of scrimmage, or at the first 5 yards, from the line of scrimmage and beyond. So I don't think it's working as much. I haven't seen any kind of triggering animations. Maybe it's something I can explore if we see coverage really start to get lower or get worse. But intentional grounding is really important. It's kind of funny. It's like what flavor do you like? It's really, do you like vanilla or do you like chocolate? Because that's kind of how intentional grounding is. Do you like it off or do you like it on? If you have it off, the perception is that the quarterback will abandon their game plan of what they had right. They called the play, that's the play. They're going to commit to it if intentional grounding's on. When they have it off, they're going to quickly get away from that. Now, it's based on the ratings, everything else. They'll scramble quicker. They'll try to run away quicker. They'll just kind of abandon what their goal was for that specific play. That tends to happen more often. Now, that's more of a working theory. There's nothing 100% given that, but it's more so when you're just judging behavior, because that's what intentional grounding is essentially. It's the behavior from there, right? I'll say as I've been working as a software tester, I've definitely learned to be a lot more calculated, a lot more thorough with my testing. And it's been a lot less placebo approach than I've seen, in that sense. But it's still not at the point where I don't smoke test or I don't try things or chaos test and try all these different things for the sake of them. And I think that's a really important part. So if you're thinking about working on sliders, working on your own sliders, be honest with yourself. Understand that, number one, you got to have tangible things, right? They have to show up. If you work on sliders, and it's a game, you have to make sure those animations show up, and you have to know what you're talking about. You have to know, how those animations appeared, and then how do you get them to go away, and then how do they accomplish the goals you're aiming for. Any questions, let me know. You leave your comments below. I will, I'm looking at this now, and I'm definitely going to try to make a little highlight of this, and hopefully it'll capture everything. But I apologize ahead of time for the length of the video. But hopefully this kind of covered, the whole breakdown. But thanks for watching, guys. As always, take care, stay tuned.